host. Welcome, everybody. Okay, so I'll make some brief introductions here, and then we'll have the talk, and there will be plenty of time for questions and input from everyone. So let me first say something about the speaker series. The John J. Jamison Jr. Visiting Professorship in the Humanities provides financial support to departments within the UAB College of Arts and Sciences for the purpose of bringing distinguished guests to campus in order to enhance the student and faculty experience. Normally this would be in person, so I'm sorry we can't bring Myisha to campus because of the pandemic, but we are fortunate to have her on Zoom. So the endowment commemorates the Jamison Investment Company's continued support of both UAB and Birmingham's flourishing arts community. So if you haven't visited Myisha's webpage, you should. Okay, it's myishacherry.org. And you see under her name, it says a philosopher striving to provide value and provoke thought. That's what she's going to do for us today. Myisha is assistant professor of philosophy at University of California, Riverside. Before that, she was a fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. She has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Illinois, Chicago. Her research interest is in how character, emotions, and attitudes intersect with issues of race and gender. And she has taught philosophy of race as well as feminist philosophy. She has quite a few books. The one that she's already published is Unmuted: Conversations on Prejudice, Oppression, and Social Justice, published by Oxford University Press. It actually is the collection based on her podcast, which she's been doing monthly since 2015. It's called the Unmute podcast. And you can check that out on her webpage. She is also a book on the moral psychology of anger that she co-edited, and a coming book on the case for rage, why anger is essential to anti-racist struggle. That's coming out in Oxford University Press this year. And I should mention, of course, the most important reason for having Myisha speak to us is that she's a public philosopher, and we need more of that. So besides hosting the podcast, she's given TEDx talk, and she's written in, let's see, The Atlantic and the Boston Review, Womankind Magazine, New Philosopher Magazine. So that's the kind of philosophy that lets people know what we as philosophers are doing and contributing to the world. And we have a very good example today. So Myisha is going to speak to us on conversations. Take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I appreciate the introduction. I want to thank the department and those responsible for putting all this together and for inviting me. Thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss what I consider a very important issue, not only morally, but also politically. I also want to thank those who have joined in. I know a lot is going on. I know that there are lots of events, lots of Zoom events that is competing for your attention. David, you can just mute your mic. I think I still hear your inputs. And everybody else, please mute your mic. I am easily distracted. But thank you so much for taking the time out, despite lots of things going on, to have this conversation with us or with me about conversations. So as David alluded to, I am the host of a philosophy podcast called the Unmute Podcast. And it was a podcast that I kind of thought about in early or later part of 2014. And one of the reasons for starting a podcast was that I wanted to give attention to philosophical issues, philosophical topics that I thought wasn't getting that much love, particularly social and political philosophy. And I also wanted to present a lot of questions and a lot of topics that I was reading in professional journals, and make it accessible to the public. Have those conversations with those authors in the podcast. Later on, in 2019, I decided to put those conversations in a book to continue to kind of add to accessibility. I recognized that there were people who didn't listen to podcasts that could still benefit from the philosophical conversations that we were having. And I also just realized that there are individuals who were just unable to, whether that because they were hearing impaired, et cetera, et cetera. And so I kind of decided to kind of continue that accessibility desire by placing it in the form of a book. Now, people may have the assumption that because I've been hosting a podcast for the last 5 years or so, that I just love conversations and I enjoy conversations and I'm able to have them in very easy ways. But when I started the podcast, and it's something that I continue to think about to this day, there were worries and there are consistent worries that I have as I go into each conversation. And I also recognize that it's not just those conversations that I have for the podcast, but in all of my conversations, I have worries. And so I've been thinking a lot about conversations recently. And let me just share with you some of the worries that I had or have, and maybe some of you all will be able to relate. So one of the things that original worry that I had, particularly during that time in which I was doing in the early stages of doing the podcast, I was a graduate student. And I was bold enough to email professors. I think someone still has their mic on, still hear inputs. I was bold enough to email professors, philosophers, asking them, begging them if they want to have a conversation with me. And so one of my concerns when I sent out the email, and also as I engaged in the conversation, was would they take me seriously as a grad student, as someone who was younger than them, as someone who was less experienced than them. Another worry that I had was, would our conversations be productive, or would we just be wasting both of our time and the audience time? Another worry that I had, as I read their work, some of y'all may know this as a result of just meeting any kind of writer or academic, their work may be prolific, but when you talk to them, it can go either way. So that was a worry that I had. Would people be as interesting as their written work was? Another worry that I had was how do I disagree and do it in a respectful manner? Right. And these conversations were live. These were responses that people could hear from me on the fly, as opposed to writing and editing and erasing. I was very concerned about not only disagreeing, because that's what we do in philosophy, but how can I do that in a respectful manner? Another worry that I had is how do I handle being challenged in that moment? And then another worry that I had is, as much as I was preparing for these conversations and excited for these conversations, I was really trying to figure out, and I'm consistently trying to figure out, how do I transfer my good skills? I think I'm pretty good. The good skills, not great, the good skills that I have, and engaging in these conversations on the podcast, how can I transfer those skills to my interpersonal conversations, right? So these are the worries that I have. And these worries have turned really into an obsession that I have about conversations. I'm really obsessed with them. I'm obsessed from a philosophical perspective of what makes them interesting. Why do we need them? How do we mess up? How do we improve? I'm obsessed with it. So when I composed the book and the conclusion of the book, I kind of reflect on some of these issues that I'm sharing with you today, and I kind of lay out what I think is at the heart of my concern. And this is a quote. It says, "Having conversations is a way for our social linguistic species to express and explain, correct and collaborate, make sense of things and make things happen." Right? This is the beauty and the benefit of conversations. And then I reflect and I say, well, anything that can do all of these things will never be easy, right? That's just the reality, right? As I began to think, and even in our current kind of atmosphere, I began to think that the problem, many might think that, well, the reason why conversations are not easy is the problem is the topics, right? It's the topics that can have the tendency to divide us, right? But I have led to the conclusion, or come to the conclusion, that the problems is not necessarily the topics that divide us. The problem is us, right? And so for the rest of the time of this talk, what I want to kind of claim and what I want to kind of convince you of is that if we work on us, we work on ourselves, then I think that our conversations, given that they're so beneficial and they are important for us to have, I think if we work on us, then our conversations will be easier. Not necessarily easy, but easier. So here are 3 questions that I think is essential for us to get there. And I'm going to kind of break the talk down into these 3 components. So I think what's important as we go about this journey of improving ourselves so that our conversations can be a little bit more easier and therefore more productive and beneficial. I think one of the questions that we need to ask is, who are we in our conversations? Another question that I think is important is what do we do when we engage in conversations? And then another question that I think is important is, how do we see our conversation partner? How do we see our conversation partner? So let's address the first question. Who are we in our conversations? So if you're familiar with philosophy at all, you know, one of our pivotal figures is Socrates. And Socrates is usually considered a wonderful conversation model, but you can tell here I have a question mark. You know, Socrates, you know, Plato writes about the dialogues, right? The Socratic method is kind of inspired by the way in which Socrates engaged conversation. So he's basically walking throughout the streets of Athens. He encounters an expert, starts a conversation with him about an ordinary topic, begins to ask questions about an ordinary topic, and then he isolates a key term from that ordinary topic and begin to ask that so-called expert, what do they think about this particular subject? You know, how do they define it? And he begins to go about challenging their perspective and their knowledge about a particular topic. What usually happens, he pushbacks on their definitions, kind of exposes the weaknesses of their definition. And the story is told that they get so frustrated that they end up leaving the conversation without even coming to the truth, right? What people usually applaud Socrates for, and one of the things that I'm going to disagree with, is that I wonder why people left the conversation, right? If Socrates is so good at conversations, you know, I kind of wonder why people always left the conversation. So this is a way to read Socrates that we may not be traditionally taught. For some people, they probably left the conversation because Socrates probably perhaps came off as arrogant. Perhaps he came off as insincere. He purported that he did not know things, right? But the way that perhaps he was pushing back on them, they kind of felt that he's coming off as insincere. Perhaps they read Socrates as being dismissive, right? And perhaps that was reasons why they left the conversation, not necessarily because they were not interested in truth, but they were not interested in discovering truth from a person who didn't exhibit certain kinds of virtues in a conversation. At least that can be one way to read Socrates. And in some ways, I kind of understand their desire to leave the conversation, right? You know, it's hard to digest advice from a hypocrite, right? And the reasons why is because character does matter in our conversations. Who we are matters in our conversations. It's also hard to share with someone who makes you feel insignificant. Why? Because character matters in a conversation. It's hard to correct someone who knows it all, or who thinks that they know it all. Why? Because character matters in our conversations, right? So here are some suggestions on how to kind of improve our character, if character matters. Here are some suggestions on how to prove it. And my suggestions are not novel. These are some of the virtues that Aristotle talked about. These are some of the virtues that a lot of epistemologists talk about. But here are some suggestions of some people to be, or a person to become in our conversations. So here are some virtues. One thing that we can exhibit in our conversations is to practice humility, right? Is to be humble, right? So as opposed to thinking that we know it all, right? We can humble ourselves. And mind you, humility, I mean, you can smell humility and you can also smell arrogance, right? And as much as it may take a lot for us to humble ourselves, humility goes a long way in the conversations that we have with others. Another thing that we can do is be tactful, right? You know, my mother used to always say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? So we can exhibit tact in our conversations. Another virtue that we can have is to be open-minded, right? So as opposed to being dogmatic as opposed to being closed-minded, as opposed to holding dear to those doctrines that or those principles that we think are just infallible. We can be open-minded to the person that we are engaged in a conversation with. Another virtue that we can exhibit in our conversation is to be generous, right? And I think one of the adages that we usually indicate with generosity is that we give people the benefit of the doubt, right? So as opposed to immediately judging them, or interpret them to be a kind of person, we're generous, right? We give them the benefit of the doubt. Another virtue that we can exhibit in our conversations is not only generosity, but also patience, right? We can be patient in our conversations. I mean, one of the temptations, particularly for me, as I go about my ordinary conversations with folks, is particularly when someone is sharing something and an idea pop in your head. And as soon as the idea pops in your head, you want to immediately, talk about it, even if that person is talking. And sometimes we have a tendency to interrupt them by saying, not to cut you off, but, right? But when we exhibit patience, right, we're able to extend it, kind of extend a kind of patience that we allow that person to talk and wait our turn until we're able to share. And in doing that, we basically say, well, I know what came to my mind. I think it's important, I think it's relevant, but it's not as important as what the person, my conversation partner, is sharing with me. And being able to exhibit patience in that moment is important, right? So these are some virtues that we can exhibit. And as much as we typically think of these things being kind of great things to practice, generosity, patience, humility, we can also exhibit what for lots of people may be vices in other contexts, but could also be virtues in certain contexts. And this is kind of what I mean. So I have a conversation with philosopher Meena Krishnamurthy, and she talks about distrust. And usually we have a tendency to perceive distrust as a vice, right? We have a tendency that if you're engaging in a conversation with someone, you don't want to, not trust them, right? That's not a bad thing to do because you're not going to be able to grow. You're not going to be able to learn, particularly if they haven't given you any reasons. But one of the things that Meena Krishnamurthy challenges us is that there's some people that we enter in conversation with. In her context, she's very interested in those that we work and do political and social work with. She says some people kind of deserve our distrust. And in some ways, as we work with them, as we have conversations with them, this may be important to extend to them so that they can live up to the task of gaining our trust and doing better. So it can challenge them to do better. So I want to quote the conversation that I have with her. This political distrust is part of a system of checks and balances. It's a way of making sure that democracy and justice stays on the straight and narrow so that we are pushing forward and trying to make progress. And she continues, and because of our biases, the way that vested interests come into play in politics, we need another check. And I think that this element of distrust can serve as that important check and point us in the right direction, right? So there are certain people that don't deserve our immediate trust in a conversation. And we need to show to them that they need to work for that particular trust. And in that context, distrust can be a virtue. And we can add a whole bunch of quote unquote vices that in a certain context, they can be virtues, right? So not only should we change who we are in conversations, right? But I also think that there are certain things that we should do, certain behaviors that we should also change. I honestly believe that we have a tendency, or at least a temptation, to engage in certain kind of moves or make certain kind of moves that I think is destructive to our conversations, right? And I want to kind of pin out some of those destructive moves that we tend to make, even if it's not intentional, that we tend to make in our conversations. So I also have a conversation with philosopher Veronica Ivy, formerly Rachel McKinnon. And in the book and in the podcast, she kind of introduces, before gaslighting became kind of part of our popular parlance, she focuses on gaslighting. And she talks about how gaslighting, when you gaslight someone, so you can imagine that someone comes to you and they want to have a conversation with you and they want to share with you something that has dramatically and tragically happened to them, right? She says, well, gaslighting, a person who's gaslighting downplays the seriousness of an injustice that someone claims to have suffered. And they tend to directly attack the reliability of the affected person's perceptions of the events or their memory of the event. So you can imagine You want to have a conversation with someone that you believe that you trust, and you want to explain to them something that has happened to you, right? And that person makes a destructive move in the conversation by gaslighting you when they say, well, what happened to you? Well, that wasn't really abuse. That wasn't really racism, right? Or they direct your reliability, right? Saying that you may have been confused or you took it the wrong way, right? And she continues, some more things that that person can say is that maybe you're just overreacting, or he wouldn't do, this is defending the wrongdoer, he wouldn't do that sort of thing, right? And like I said before, one needing intentionally engage in gaslighting, right? That one can even, I think, when the temptation to gaslight really comes about when we're trying to be objective. So we want to be caring on the one hand, but we also want to be objective on the other hand. And I think sometimes when we overly correct and being objective, we are more prone to engage in gaslighting, right? And that's a destructive move in our conversation. Another destructive move, and I'm going to quote myself here, that we can do is not only downplaying the reliability of the person, not only failing to take seriously what that person has to say, but we can also engage in a destructive move that I call anger policing, right? There's a tendency to also call this tone policing to refer to emotions more general. So what happens when you anger police? The very presence of anger. So you can imagine someone comes to you and they want to have a conversation with you and they're just upset about what has happened, right? So, you know, an injustice, something wrong has happened, whether you have initiated or whether someone else has initiated, but they're coming to you and they're not stoic about it. They're not calm about it. They're angry, right? So how are you engaging in anger policing in that conversation? Well, you're engaging in anger policing when the very presence of the anger, the very fact that person is angry, leads us to conclude that that anger is not permissible, right? So we're not necessarily interested in what the cause of that anger is, what the situation is, and allowing that person to tell us more, right? The very anger, the very presence of the anger turns us off, right? And we immediately disapprove of everything that that person says as a result of the anger. That's a destructive move, right? Anger policing also happens when we insincerely dictate the terms of the discussion with the goal of ignoring the wrongdoing, right? So a person who engages in anger policing in that way, what happens is that they want to control the conversation. And the way that they control the conversation is they basically say, well, I'm not going to continue to listen to you until you calm down, right? Right. And they usually make this particular move in order to ignore the whole purpose or the whole reason for calming down, right? And only being concerned with his or her own feelings, and thus is unwilling to sympathize. Perhaps the anger makes them uncomfortable, right? And despite what one is angry about, what one wants to share with that person, they don't really care about your feelings. They're more concerned about how uncomfortable that anger makes them feel. And if that is you, you are engaging in anger policing. So Audre Lorde kind of talks about this, and she says, usually a popular quote when you go to someone and you want to have a conversation with them about something that has happened to you, the response is, tell me how you feel. And this is what a woman said to her when they had a conversation about racism. The white woman said to her, tell me how you feel, but don't say it too harshly or I cannot hear you, right? Right. And the problem with this is that we value the expression or the venue or the medium of the expression without a sensitivity to what the person is actually feeling and the wrongdoing that is bringing about the anger. Right? Another destructive move that we can make, and I also want to quote myself here, and this destructive move in which I'm calling grammar guarding. I usually find this destructive move online, and I must admit that I have committed this destructive move, and I've learned not to do this. So here's an example of the grammar guards, and this is how I kind of describe this in the book. A grammar guard is a person who randomly appears on your social media feed as you're having a conversation with people. And the whole purpose is for them to be super rational men whose sole mission is to save the day by demolishing every comment that doesn't have the proper logical structure or spelling, right? So this is the person who says, well, you didn't spell this right. Power, or they may say, hey, your vowels are confused. So this is the person who corrects grammar, right? And this discourages conversations right when we need it the most, right? And some of you all, I know it's not just me, who've gone on a social media thread and an important conversation is happening. And sometimes this usually happens with people that we disagree with, right? As opposed to engaging in the conversation, meeting them on their own terms, we basically notice that they've made a spelling mistake and we check it, right? And I want to say that that may get you likes on social media, but it discourages conversation right when we need it the most. Another similar destructive move that I think we have a tendency to make for all those Office fans out there. Pardon me if you never watched an episode of the Office, but there's a character by the name of Oscar. I really love Oscar. He's probably one of my favorite characters on The Office. But one of the things that Oscar is known for, and this is a horrible character trait, is that he has a tendency that when people are having conversations, and if they don't communicate a correct fact or not, he interrupts the conversation and he begins by saying, well, actually, right? And then he corrects the fact, right? So Oscar is never really interested in the conversation, right? He's only interested in correcting someone's mistake, right? And similar to grammar guards, if you do this, this discourages conversations. Usually the fact that it's being checked has really no importance and no bearing on the actual topic or the actual argument, right? It's a move that's usually made to highlight how smart we are, to put the person who's making the point in a position in which they feel inferior, right? It discourages conversations right when we need it the most. So don't participate in this destructive move, right? So here are some suggestions not to do those kinds of things, right? Not to engage in gaslighting, not to engage in anger or tone policing, not to be a grammar guard or an actually agent. Here are some suggestions. If you're doing either one of these things, then stop doing them, no matter how much you may be rewarded, right? And there are books on this that kind of talks about how social media kind of encourages us. I mean, the dopamine rises in us when we get likes, right? And that all the more encourages kind of destructive, uncivil behavior, right? And I know we want to be objective as much as possible. And I know we want to protect our friends, right? And we don't want people to think certain things about them, right? So we may have a tendency to suggest if someone complains about them, that they are wrong or they are mistaken in their perceptions. But we have to be very careful that there's a fine line that we don't engage in gaslighting. So if we're doing any of those destructive moves, and if you notice that you've done them, then the first thing we need to do to correct that behavior is to stop engaging in such behavior. Another suggestion I would suggest is if you're prone, if being an actually agent or being a grammar guard or being a gaslighter is your default, then perhaps as a default, you need to start with doing the opposite, right? So as opposed to immediately gaslighting someone in a conversation, you can give them the benefit of the doubt, right? That can be the default, right? That you believe them until you have no other reason to believe them, right? Another thing that you can do the complete opposite, as opposed to correcting grammar or correcting someone's fact, you can just listen, right? And refraining from correcting, right? You can just point out the things that they are correct about. So we can do the opposite. And another thing that we can do, and the third kind of behavior that we can do as a corrective, really depends on the context. And this requires us to be very sensitive to context, right? And if we're sensitive to context, what we'll realize is that the context would tell us the moves that we ought to make in our conversations. So here's an example of what I'm referring to. And this comes out of a conversation that I had with Cassie Herbert. And one of the things that she suggests is that usually what we should do if someone is coming to a conversation with us, one of the best things that we can do is to ask. So not to correct, not to judge, but one of the things that we can do is ask. So what does she mean by that? She says, you can imagine someone coming to you in a conversation and explaining to you something that has happened to them, right? An injustice that has happened to them. And this is not the only kind of conversations that we have, but this is the example that she points out. Imagine someone is coming to you, and if we ask them in the right context, properly supportive, right? What do you want to happen, right? So let me give you a little bit more context. So imagine someone comes to you and say, hey, such and such has done this to me, right? Listen to me. I want to tell you what has happened to me, right? She says, if you're sensitive to context, right? One of the best things that you can do is that moment to exercise sensitivity is just to ask that person, so what do you want me to do with this information, right? What do you want to happen as a result of this conversation, right? She continues, she says, oftentimes someone would tell us through that answer what it is that they're looking for, right? They would tell us if we're sensitive and we ask, they would tell us if they're looking for belief, right? They would tell us, hey, I just want you to believe me. Don't do anything else, right? She says, that's huge, especially when a person is reporting on a serious injustice, because those things so often are disbelieved, right? So just looking for belief often is in and of itself incredibly significant, right? So in that moment, a person is not looking for you to be objective, right? Right. In that moment, that person is not interested in you correcting their facts, right? In that moment, if you ask them, if you're sensitive, if you ask them, they will tell you what exactly they need from you in that particular moment. And that comes about by being sensitive to context. Another thing that, if we are on the other end, as we're engaging in a conversation, we can also tell people what we want in our conversations. I mean, this is all pointing to, kind of what I think is perhaps a problem for a lot of our conflicts, is that we expect people to read our minds, or that we think that we know so much about a person that we can always predict what we ought to do next. And if we are engaged in a conversation, right, we're having verbal communication, that is a prime opportunity for us to be very explicit about what we want from each other, right? And to be completely honest and completely humble about what we're willing to do and not to do. So as much as in that moment, we can ask that person, what is it that you want me to do as a result of this conversation? If we're on the other end, we can also tell that person what we want to do with this particular information, right? Those are constructive moves that can occur in our conversations. And then another thing that we can do, being sensitive to context, is that we can listen, right? I mean, I noticed that for a lot of my conversations, and this all, a lot of times depend on the content and the topic, is that a lot of times we think that for conversations, what we are expected to do in that moment is to talk. And sometimes the best things that we can do in a conversation is to not say anything, right? Not give them the best cliche, not give them, point them to an article that you read in The Atlantic. But the best things for lots of folk, for us to do in our conversation, is just simply to listen to one another, right? And that goes a long way. All right. So we can change who we are in our conversation, so we can be more humble, we can be tactful, we can be sensitive, right? We also can change the things that we do in our conversations, right? So we can be more context sensitive and less prone to engage in destructive moves such as gaslighting, also such as tone policing, grammar guarding, et cetera, et cetera. But another question that I think is important to get us to having better conversations is that we can change the way we see each others in our conversation, right? Because just as I think that there are destructive moves that we make in our conversations, I think that there are oftentimes a distorted vision that we have about our conversation partners. So let me explain what I mean by this. Sometimes we have a tendency, and this may not be the case with all of our conversations, sometimes we tend to do this with only certain kinds of individuals, but you can have a distorted vision of your conversation partner, of your interlocutor, when you view them simply as an audience member, right? As an audience member. What do I mean by this? When you view your conversation partner as an audience member, You look at them as the passive listener. So this is the person that's just there to listen to you, right? And you become the active narrator. So you're the one, that's going to do all the talking. You're the one that's going to do all the schooling, right? And you treat that person as the person that's supposed to just be there to listen, right? And I want to say that that's a distorted vision. When you think that those that you speak to, those that you engage in conversation, should always, in all contexts, be your audience member, then you're viewing them with a distorted picture, right? That doesn't help our conversations, or at least our productive ones, but it takes away from it, right? When you view your conversation partner as an audience member, you view them as individuals that need to be schooled, right? And you see how this distorted vision also, can play into kind of vicious aspects of our character, right? Right. So only, a person who thinks that people that they are engaged in conversation with is an audience that need to be schooled is not a person who is humble. It's a person who is arrogant, right? It's not a person who is open-minded. It's a person who's pretty close-minded, right? I also think that when you view your interlocutor, your conversation partner, as someone who's supposed to be schooled, most of the times what you're going to be doing, what you're going to be engaging in, if you are a man, then you're more apt, you're more prone to engage in mansplaining, right? Because there's nothing that this woman can teach you about sexism, right? Because you know it all and you need to school her, right? When you treat your conversation partner as an audience member, if you're white, you're going to engage in what we call white-splaining, right? You're going to let the conversation partner who's a person of color, you're going to teach them about racism, right? As opposed to learning from them and listening to their voice, right? Distorted vision of a conversation partner is when we view them as an audience member. The great educator, Paulo Freire, talks about this distorted vision in his seminal text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he wants to make a distinction between this kind of conversation, also this kind of education. And he makes a distinction by clearly defining what dialogue really consists of, right? And he simply suggests, he says, dialogue within the problem-posing system of education for him, dialogue, true dialogue, it rejects communiques, right? And it embodies communication, right? Real dialogue rejects monologue conversations, right? True dialogue embodies true communication in which I talk and you talk, I share and you share, I teach and you teach, you learn and I learn, right? That's dialogue for Freire, right? It rejects monologues, communiques, and it embodies real communication. And dialogue is exactly what conversations is all about, right? Another distorted vision that we can have of the person that we are engaged in conversation with is not only will we have the tendency to view them as an audience member, but we can also have a tendency to view them as epistemic laborers, right? What is an epistemic laborer? An epistemic laborer is kind of the contrast of treating your conversation partner as an audience that is supposed to be a passive listener. If you treat your audience or you treat your conversation partner as an epistemic laborer, you make them do all the teaching, you make them do all the talking. Let me give you some more descriptions, right? When you treat your conversation partner as an epistemic laborer, right? A person who's supposed to do the work of teaching you, you simply say, hey, I'm here so that you can teach me, right? Do all the work of teaching me, right? If you're a male, right, you'll put the epistemic burden on a woman. Tell me everything you need to tell me about sexism and misogyny, right? Right. Another kind of a flaw here is that what happens is that you engage in what I call group work fallacy, right? Or you commit the group work fallacy. And anyone who's ever did any high school group project, any college project, one thing about working in groups is that usually, this is why I don't do it in my own courses, usually with group work, it's always one person that's doing all the work and everyone else benefits from their work, right? And you have a distorted perspective about your conversation partner when no matter what the topic is, and particularly this really occurs when the topic is a very heavy topic, is that when you make your conversation partner do all the work that's required to mend the relationship via conversation, to do all the teaching or educating when it comes to conversations, right? One person does all the work, but this should not be, right? Because usually what happens as a result of treating your conversation partner as an epistemic laborer is that we put all the work on their shoulders, and this becomes emotionally taxing for them. Usually what happens is that we expect for them to do all the work, all the epistemic labor without being properly compensated, right? And depending on one's social identity or position in society, is usually what happens is that we make them do all the work and we still meet their knowledge and their information with skepticism, right? This is a distorted view of our conversation partner. They are not our epistemic laborers, nor are they our audience member. Audre Lorde talks about this in her essay, Uses of Anger. And she talks about how this can drain the energy of individuals. She says, Black and third world people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. Women are expected to educate men. And what happens is, as they're doing this education work, right, they're engaging in this epistemic labor, the oppressors usually maintain their position, so they're not moved by this education. They're also evade their own responsibility for their actions. And she says this is a constant drain of energy. Right? This is a constant drain of energy. I mean, some of you are probably thinking, well, how are certain people supposed to learn? Well, you know, as being part of a moral community, we can share an epistemic education, right? So as opposed to making your only Black friend teach you all about racism, you can grab some books and read them for yourself. Right? As opposed to allowing that Black person or that woman that you're in solidarity with educate men to kinds of issues of sexism and misogyny. As a man, you can also share an epistemic labor by teaching men about sexism or misogyny, right? Correcting them when they engage in it, as opposed to allowing women to do all the work. We can share in the labor as opposed to requiring that our conversation partner do all the work without us joining in. And it's for this reason that I'm very skeptical of conversations in our current ethos, in which, whether that's a Black person, whether that's a woman, whose sole job is to educate white people or educate certain kinds of people in power about the atrocities, the mistreatment, and even the dignity of certain kinds of human beings. I don't think this should be left on the shoulders. If we're going to enter into true communication, right, and true dialogue that requires character traits from both of us, that requires for us to view each other in a certain kind of way, we can't put that work and that labor on the shoulders of one individual. That as conversation partners, we all must share in that particular work, right? Another way that we can have a distorted vision of our conversation partner, not only can we rely on them to be epistemic laborers, in which they do all the work of teaching us in our conversation, but we can also allow them or expect them to do all the emotional work in our conversations, right? Because conversations are not just exchanges of information or exchanges of knowledge, right? When we come to conversations, we're coming with our full humanity, and our full humanity is not just limited to the rational, but we also come to those conversations with emotions, right? We come to them with emotions and feelings. But we can hold a distorted view of our conversation partner when we expect one person to do all the emotional work within our conversations. And that is a distorted vision. So here's some examples of the ways in which we can view our conversation partner as emotional laborers. And some of you all may be able to relate to this, whether you're on the receiving end or the giving end, is you have that friend who only calls you up when they need advice, right? So you're always advising them, you're always investing in them. And usually is the case that they're not around to advise you, right? And if you're doing that, you are engaging in or viewing your conversation partner as an emotional laborer. Another way that you can do this, what happens is that we become the center of the conversation. So you can imagine you're having a conversation with a friend, and you're only interested in talking about you, right? Even when you allow that person to talk, the conversation still revolves around you, right? And your needs, right? You are treating that person as an emotional laborer, right? And usually what makes this problematic is that there's no reciprocity, right? In our conversations, like I said, in relationship to epistemic laborers, we should share in knowledge giving, right? And we can also share in emotional giving, that not one person should do all the emotional work in a conversation, that we should feel free that if I need to call you up, that you will give me advice. And in that same conversation, I may need to give you advice, right? We share in emotional labor. Justice Zimmerman, a journalist, points us to the reality that there are certain kinds of people that we have conversations with that we expect to engage in emotional labor. And she challenged us to kind of think differently about these individuals when we engage in conversation. And to be very clear, she's talking about women. So usually is the case when we enter into conversations with women, we expect for them to do all the emotional labor. She says, we as women are told frequently that women are more intuitive, more empathetic, more innately willing and able to offer secure advice, right? So we think that's just who they naturally are. How convenient that this cultural construct gives men an excuse to be emotionally lazy. And this doesn't just extend to gender, but this is an example. How convenient that it casts feeling-based work as an internal need, an aspiration, supposedly coming from the depths of our female character, right? She wants to say that this is not the case, right? People are not naturally a thing, so much so that we ought to use them to give us this particular thing, right? In a way in which we have been comfortable with treating women as emotional laborers, that we fell into kind of the myth that this is just naturally who they are, right? But I want to tell you that women are not naturally these things, and they're not put on earth to be your epistemic laborer or your emotional laborers in conversation, right? And we can extend this to so many other kinds of people, right? And to think that they are is to have a distorted vision of our conversation partners. Audre Lorde continues this, and she kind of puts a stop to this. She says, Black women are expected to use our anger only in the service of other people's salvation, right? Other people's learning. And then she declares that time is over. All right, so here are some suggestions so that we won't have the distorted view that I suggest that we are prone to have of our conversation partners. So one of the things we can do is, if you see people as epistemic laborers, if you see your conversation partner as an emotional laborer all the time, if you see your conversation partner as someone who is just simply an audience member, they have nothing to contribute, one of the things that you can do is begin to actually see them, right? What do I mean by this? Paul Taylor, in a conversation that I have with him, he talks about how for lots of people in society, they are rendered invisible. And he describes this in relationship to Black folk. He says, invisibility is just that Black people in particular don't register as persons, as people with perspectives, or as people with subject positions that are worth considering. They're not racially unmarked because you're hypervisible as a racial object. And so a way to do this is to see them, right? Is to begin to see them, right? Begin to see our conversation partners as people that have perspectives, right? Begin to see them as people who have knowledge to give. So no matter how educated you think you are or how smart you think you are, to see our conversation partners as people with perspectives, as people with knowledge, right? One of the things that, my mother has always taught me is that no matter what background you come from, that person can always teach you something, right? And oftentimes we render people invisible as people not worth engaging in. But we need to see people. And one of the ways of seeing them is seeing their perspectives and seeing them as knowledge givers. Another thing we can do is not only see them, but to begin to see our conversation partners for who they actually are. An example of this is a conversation that I had with David Livingston Smith, who's a scholar in dehumanization. And this is how he defines dehumanization. He says, we dehumanize others when we think of those others, some subhuman creatures. You might Think of me as appearing to be human, but not being human on the inside where it matters, being a beast, being an animal, being a monster, right? We can have a tendency to dehumanize people, and that can stop us from even wanting to enter into a conversation with them, right? And so one of the things that we can see people, begin to see people as human, begin to see them for who they really are, which are human beings. And human beings are beings, with needs. They are persons, right? They have feelings. They also have agency, right? So they're not there to be controlled by us, right? And when we begin to do this, we begin to see kind of a change in our conversations, right? And then last but not least, we can begin to change how we see ourselves. Now, one way is that we can begin to change how we see ourselves to make our conversations go more easy and to be more productive is to stop looking at ourselves as superior, and to stop seeing ourselves as the center of the universe. For one thing, we're not superior. And for one thing, we're not the center of the universe. I started this talk suggesting that Socrates is often considered a conversation model for lots of folk. And I simply suggested that for lots of people, even to the people that he had conversations with, they may disagree. And I want to propose a different conversation model. And the model that I'm thinking about is James Baldwin. So when I read James Baldwin's work, in which his essays and even in his fiction, he's having a conversation with us. When you think about his written work, in which he's actually engaged in conversations with other people, you see kind of, and even in the interviews that he engaged in, you see him engaged in conversation. And I think he serves as a wonderful model of who we are, or who we should be in our conversations, what we should do in our conversations, and how we should view our conversation partners. I think some of the things that he was able to exhibit in his life through the conversations that he had with readers, but also individuals that he disagreed with, is that he was able to be honest. He was able to be courageous, that he was able to extend compassion to those he had a conversation with. And I think there's no other person that describes Baldwin as an excellent conversation partner than Toni Morrison when she gave his eulogy in 1987. So this is what she says in her eulogy to James Baldwin. She says, "In your hands, you gave us language, and you showed that language was handsome again. In your hand, we saw how it was meant to be." This is language, and we can even add conversation here. How it was meant to be, neither bloodless nor bloody, and yet alive, right? The beauty of language, that language and our conversations can be handsome again. It need not be bloodless nor bloody. Our conversations can be alive. And then she began to list out who James Baldwin was that allowed us to take this away from his language. She says, it is a courage that she saw in him that came from a ruthless intelligence married to a pity so profound it could convince anyone. And she continues talking about who he was and how he viewed others. She says, it was a tenderness so delicate that I thought it could not last, but last it did. A vulnerability that asked everything, expected everything. She continues, you knew, didn't you, how strengthened I was by the certainty that came from knowing you would never hurt me. I think this is wonderful characteristics of the kind of conversation partner that we can all be. That there will be a testament to our lives when someone is able to make a remark that we made conversations neither bloodless or bloody, but we made our conversations alive because we showed intelligence, but yet we showed pity, because we were honest, because we were tender, because the person who was engaged in conversation with us knew and was certain that we would not hurt them in our conversation, right? That's a wonderful model. So I want to wrap up here by making clear about some of the things that I am saying that I want you to take away from the talk, and some of the things that I'm not saying. So one of the things that I'm not saying that we should have conversations that compromise our self-respect and our dignity, right? So I'm not saying that we should have conversations with people who do not think that we are human, right? and try to exhibit the best virtues as possible to convince them of anything, right? I'm even going to say, and we depend on how the Q&A goes here, I even want to suggest that those persons are probably not persons that you should have conversations with, right? So I want to say that this is not to say that we should have conversations that compromise our self-respect and our dignity. This is also not to say I am not overly optimistic about what conversations can do in the world. I am not saying that conversations will solve everything. I'm not saying that it would cure cancer or cure racism, right? And this is one of the reasons why I disagree with Malcolm Gladwell's conclusions in his Talking to Strangers book. And I just want to provide a brief quote here. And for those who are familiar with the book, he starts off talking about the conversation that the police officer has with Sandra Bland. And he ends the book returning back to this conversation. And this is what he says. He says, quote, "So it was that Brian Encinia, this is the police officer, ended up in a place he should never have been, stopping someone who should never have been stopped, drawing conclusions he should never have been drawn." And then he says, "The death of Sandra Bland is what happens when a society does not know how to talk to strangers." Now, I disagree with this. I think there's a lot of reasons, a lot of things that caused her death. And it was not because they were not able to have a conversation. I would even suggest that one of the things that caused her death was not that strangers were not able to have a conversation, but the fact that the police officer saw her as a stranger, right? So things went awry before there could even be a conversation, right? So conversations could not have brought Sandra Bland back from the dead. I'm not that overly optimistic, right? I also would say that I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus on ending structures that create reasons for a lot of our conversations, particularly our political conversations, right? I don't think that racism can be hugged out. And as a result of me and 5 other white people talking, or me and 5 other men talking, that sexism and racism will come to an end. I think we need to focus on ending those structures, and having interpersonal conversations are not going to do it. What am I saying? I'm trying to propose a challenge to you. What I'm suggesting is for us to be better, moral and political citizens. I'm asking for us to see better, change the way in which we see each other. And I'm also asking for us to do better in our conversations. And if we do that, then we can get the benefits of our conversations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Myisha. So we have about half an hour. So let's do this, right? Because some of you will be able to raise hands, and you raise hands, I will probably see you at the top of the list. But if you aren't able to do that, you can put your name, just let me know through the chat that you have a question. So that we can proceed in that way. So who would like to raise their hands or add something to the chat? I see Lindsay has jumped in. Go ahead, Lindsay. Can you unmute yourself, or are you prevented from doing that?
I can. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk that I really appreciated. I wanted to ask you, because you're a professor and I'm a professor here at UAB, how you kind of navigate some of these conversational virtues with students.
Right.
I hate lecturing because I don't like talking to an audience. I'd rather have a conversation, but there clearly are some, asymmetries in knowledge and in power and all sorts of things that bring about different kinds of conversational needs. So do you have any guidance for me and other faculty here?
Yeah, so let's talk about teaching a little bit. It's interesting, as you begin to talk, I started thinking about one of the things that I usually put in one of my courses, a tagline that I put in one of my courses. And one of the tagline is to kind of be respectful. These are not only academic issues, but these are issues that affect real world folk, particularly people in the course, right? And I use that as kind of a preparation of sorts to kind of remind us not to talk in the abstract, but to be respectful. And the question is, what does that respect mean? And I kind of, throughout the course, we learn exactly what that means, because I find that to be kind of a challenge, right? Because the ways in which I teach is not just lecturing, but real philosophy happens. I mean, as much as I beat up on Socrates here, I honestly do believe that it comes as a result of dialogue and engagement. And I need to know what my students are thinking. I need to know what are their questions. I need to know what are their input. And I'm totally open to that. I mean, that's what philosophy is for me. But I think there's a careful balance there, right? It's the same kind of balance that I think happens in our interpersonal spaces as well, right? And here's the thing: there's not a blueprint that's going to fit every occasion, but I think there's some tips there. So like I said, one of the things that I already prime my students is to kind of recognize what we're talking about so that we can have some respect there. But I also, students, they share their experiences. And one of the things that I'm very mindful of, is to recognize, particularly when students are vulnerable enough to share kind of personal experiences, even if that point that they're trying to prove, in which the experience is a premise of, right, or supporting of, is to still respect the fact that they were exhibiting some important virtues in that space, and to kind of applaud that. So there's like little tidbits that we can do. Thank you for sharing that. You didn't have to share that with us. But as far as what you just said, I don't know. So I think there's a balancing line that we can put into practice, in which there's respect happening. There's also validation that's happening. I also think I recognize that I have an academic understanding of the topic, but I also think that knowledge is always living, and it doesn't originate from one particular source. It flows, it get creolized. And so even as I understand that I am an authority in the room, I am an authority about a particular thing, right? And that authority is not restricted to that. Here's the thing that I'm authority on. It's still very, very, very much narrow. I mean, there's moments where I'm putting together IKEA furniture, and I basically remind myself, I have a PhD, but it's taking me 3 hours to put IKEA furniture together, right? Very humbling moment. And if that's the case when it comes to IKEA furniture in the classroom, yes, I have this PhD, right? And I have this, but even that is very narrow to a particular topic. I wrote a dissertation about a particular topic, right? The PhD is deceiving. It says that I have a doctorate in philosophy. No, not really. I already have a doctorate in my dissertation. And that reminds me to remain humble and to remain open-minded when I enter in that course room, right? That in any moment, what a student says can literally blow my mind, right? So I come to that space with that kind of humility, right? And here's the thing, I think in that context, when everybody's putting this stuff, put that stuff in practice, and I think as professors, we model it and students pick it up. But you'll find as the semester goes along, now we created a culture here. And that's when stuff gets real good. And that's when we begin to improve as individuals, but also we begin to learn. And that's when the learning process. And like I said, not every blueprint is going to fit every situation. I think for a lot of times it depends on the students that you get in that course and their backgrounds and the spaces that they're familiar with. Other times it depends on what you're actually teaching in the course, right? It all depends. But I think I'm hoping that my framework would at least kind of starts off with recognizing that the course will only go as well as who we are. The course will only go well as making sure that we model constructive moves as opposed to destructive ones, and the students will pick that up. The course will go well when we don't look at ourselves as this authority figure. I mean, we're not. That's just the reality. And we humble ourselves. And then that's what the real, true educational, philosophical conversations that happen in the course, in the courtroom, in the course room, in which real knowledge begins to take place. And that's when things get really, really, really good. And you'll notice, absent of that stuff, you have a horrible, miserable course that you are waiting to end, right? But I think if you at least adopt some of the stuff that I've introduced and remix it to depending on how the course, dictates it for you, I think things can go much better. I don't know if I answer your question or not, but it's a constant juggle. But I think just being sensitive to it. And at least asking the 3 questions that I kind of started off can be a good starting point to making our class conversations much more productive.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate those thoughts.
Thank you. So there's a question on the chat that I'll just read out, and maybe Myisha can respond to that.
Okay.
So I think you mentioned something about how to respond to people who are showing their anger. So the question is, specifically related to the anger policing. I do not react well to anger due to an association between yelling and physical harm from my dad. How can I balance my need to feel safe and others' need to express their emotions?
Yeah, this is tough here, right? And this goes back to a point that I was talking about, is that we don't enter into our conversations as only rational beings, as only stoic creatures. We come to our conversations not only with emotions, but we also come into our conversations with history, right? You know, I will say, and I'm gonna try to answer the question in the easiest way that I can, which requires for me to really talk about interpersonal conversations. I think communicating that to our conversation partners would be important, right? I mean, this goes back to the point that I was suggesting about mind reading is never good for any relationship, let alone any conversation, right? And to be honest and forthcoming does require a certain kind of vulnerability, right? It requires for you to be vulnerable just as you just were, right? To admit, hey, I have a kind of history in which I equate, you know, anger with insecurity, with the fact that I'm not safe, right? And you'll be amazed how, particularly the person who's respectful and loving, how that can reorientate them, even if they are already passionate, that can reorientate them in the kind of conversations that they have. So one of the things I was suggesting goes back to what I kind of suggested, is to be forthcoming. Not to say that you ought to do that with everybody you have a conversation with, because I don't think that your vulnerability should be that case, but particularly if it's an interpersonal conversation that you're having with an intimate, that to be forthcoming about that, right? I also, you know, as I was making that point, I wanted to kind of address this, because I think what tone policing and anger policing is that it's not necessarily to suggest that, hey, your anger is making me uncomfortable. That's not the end of the story, right? I think if someone is yelling at you, that is reasons for you to be unsafe. If someone is being violent, that is reason for you to feel unsafe, and you can't have a productive conversation in that particular manner. But that's really pointing to angry behavior, right? And what I was addressing when it comes to anger policing, I'm specifically referring to anger, right? Person admitting that they're angry, and you can imagine they're probably, you know, have the physical or the physiological signs of anger, but they're not yelling at you, they're not being disrespectful, you know, they're not being destructive. So I'm not talking about angry behavior, but I'm talking about anger in general. And if you know, it's hard to have conversations. You can't have a conversation with someone who's engaging in angry behavior. But if you are having a conversation with someone who is angry, and you want to proceed, and they're not acting, you know, behaving angrily, then I think admitting that vulnerability can help them to adjust. And then they would know that, hey, you're not policing them, but you're coming from a different kind of place. And if they had any kind of care or concern or love about you, they will orientate. That's not enough for them to no longer be angry, but I think that will help them to adjust. And if they can adjust for the sake of you, perhaps you need to put the conversation on hold until there is proper time and add time to have that actual conversation.
Great, thanks. Bryn, you're next.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much. This is such a great talk. I have a question that is related to what you just said and something you mentioned in the talk, which is sort of like, how do you exhibit the virtues, but also know when to either not engage from the start or know when to say this is over. I'm gonna exit the conversation, but make those decisions in a way. Oh, Marshall said I froze.
Repeat your question. You didn't froze on my end. You didn't freeze on my end.
Okay. So how do you decide whether to not enter into a conversation or decide the point at which you need to exit the conversation in a way that's consistent with exhibiting the conversational virtues that you mentioned?
Yeah, so this goes back to being context sensitive, right? And so it's, you know, as a philosopher, we want to lay out these principles that also apply in all instances. But there are some moments, I mean, this is where I'm getting to non-ideal theory here, right? In an ideal world, all you have to do is do the 3 things that I suggested and you're good, right? But these are human conversations that we're talking about. We're not talking about having conversations with Siri or Google or Alexa, right? We're talking about, you know, having conversations with humans. And humans are not idea species. I mean, we're human. I mean, right? We're human. Usually when people say, well, I'm only human, they're pointing to the fallibility and the awfulness of our human nature, right? So things are not always going to go the way in which we expect it, right? We can get overly sensitive in ways that kind of disrupts it. And then there's a lot of times in which we think that a certain kind of thing deserves a conversation when it doesn't. And this is where we need to be careful. So I think I know what you're talking about when you say, well, I mentioned this, but let me mention it again. So one of the things as far as entering, knowing when to enter, you should ask yourself, what kinds of conversations am I not willing to enter into? And Audre kind of talks about this, you know, the time of educating white people or men to our humanity is over, right? And maybe you want to write a philosophy paper about defending your humanity. That's not my project. I don't have time to do that. But one of the things I would suggest, you know, for myself, certain conversations that I refuse to enter into, one of those conversations is I'm not going to enter into a conversation in which I'm trying to prove to you that I am a human being. That is not just a conversation stopper. That's not even a starter for me, right? So I am not a person who's going to go around the country. This is just not me. Maybe someone else needs it. I'm not going to go around a redemption reconciliation conference trying to convince white supremacists to see me as a human being. Those are not the conversations that I'm willing to engage in, right? Because we're not even entering into the conversation on an equal plane, right? And there's a great chance in which, and there's evidence to suggest there's a great chance that I'm going to be more humiliated and disrespected, right? And so they will give me reasons. But I don't think that just extends to issues of race, right? Can it also extend to, I'm also not going to have a conversation with an extreme misogynist, right? But I'm also not going to have a conversation with a person that I know just doesn't take me serious because he just doesn't like me as Myisha, right? I already know that up front, right? Maybe I could get one of my friends to talk to him, right? But that's usually a stopper. Now people can always redeem themselves, but one of the things that I think is a stopper, not even something that we engage in when it comes on the conversation, when we know that the topic is going to be, are you human? Right? Give me reasons not to respect you. Or to respect you. That to me is not a conversation starter. And maybe perhaps for other people, they can kind of fill in those gaps. But I think those are one of the conversations, things that's a stopper. As far as to you're already in a conversation, but now we need to stop. Whew, there's a lot of answers. And I think depending on your disposition, depending on the topic, depending on the behavior, that will also suggest when we need to stop. So the previous comment mentioned angry behavior as I was kind of interpreting it. So anytime we know that it's no longer about what's being said, but now we've turned into kind of violent action, whether that's abusive action verbally or abusive action physically, we know that the conversation is kind of over in that regard. But I also think that there are certain kind of impasses that happens in our conversations. And sometimes, you know, I'm open to impasses. Impasses suggest, well, we can no longer go forward, but it doesn't mean that we can't pick this up, right? And it's on both ends, right? So being sensitive and also welcoming to impasses, to say that impasses is a reason to pause, but not to stop, right? Because it could be the case that both of us are not ready, or you're not ready, or you're not the kind of person, I'm not the kind of person, I'm not mature enough, I'm too emotional right now. So let's stop for a moment and we can pick this up. And I think for lots of us, we need to recognize when the conversations need to be paused as opposed to stopped, right? And that's something to kind of figure out. And I can't give you a principle to kind of to kind of go off of. I think that's also kind of contextual. But for lots of conversations that we stop, they need to be paused. And for and lots of conversations that need to be paused, actually need to be stopped. And maybe someone can write a paper about perhaps what those are. But noticing that there's a difference there between all three of those distinctions are important for us. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's a good segue for me to kind of jump in here, since I don't see any hands. So we are all working on campuses, and there's an environment that has these two forces pulling in opposite directions, because we want to foster conversations, especially on difficult or sensitive topics. So we talk about abortion, we talk about racism, we talk about all these issues. But on the other hand, right, universities, a lot of them have speech codes to try to police conversations. I know your talk is more on the individual level, how we can become better at it. But what do you think about the role of institutions, especially educational institutions?
Yeah. I knew an institutional question will come.
Sorry.
No, but I think that gets difficult. I mean, here's a quick answer. A quick answer is institutions should encourage conversation. And things are going to get difficult here because we're going to have issues of platforming and free speech, right? Those are big kind of, and the question is what are institutional roles in relationship to free speech and a free exchange of ideas, and also conversations. And then it also depends on what that institution is and who that institution is. I'm trying to get out of answering your question. So one of the things this is tough. I mean, there's a lot of philosophers who've done work on this area. Amina Srinivasan has a wonderful paper on no platforming. And there's been folks that kind of more inclined to kind of address this issue. But one of the things I would say is that institutions should welcome it. But here's a challenge. And this is me being humble here. I do wonder how much of what I said that happened on the interpersonal level can apply to the institutional, right? Are there just some conversations institutionally, even in educational spaces in which we want the free exchange of ideas? Are there certain kind of conversations that still shouldn't be had on the conversational level, right? So should universities invite handsome, well-dressed members of the alt-right to address their community so that people can have a conversation about that, right? And what is more valuable? Is it more valuable for an institution to be a space of free speech, no matter if that speech takes away freedoms or questions the freedoms of certain kinds of individuals that make up that community, right? These are kind of important kind of social and policy questions that I think lots of universities have been asking themselves for the last 3 years. And my view on an interpersonal would suggest that there are certain conversations that shouldn't be had. And I think that can be applied to the institution, and that's just me morally. Whether the institutions agree with that is another thing, right? But I think there's a crisis in which I think, or let's just say a reckoning, where institutions really have to figure out what is its most important value, right? Is it the value knowledge, no matter what that knowledge is, to value conversations, no matter what that conversation is? Or is it to value knowledge, but also value the students that are under its charge, to make sure that the students that leave that university are educated, but also have their dignity intact when they leave? And if that's more valuable than just free speech simpliciter, then no, we can't invite certain kinds of people on campus. Right? And mind you, not inviting certain people on campus is not people that you disagree with. I'm talking about specifically spaces in which conversations are going to be had, and which is pretty clear that they don't respect the humanity of certain kinds of individuals that that institution serve. And to me, that's a conversation, that's not even a conversation starter, right? That's an indication that that's a certain kind of conversation that shouldn't be had. But that's more on the policy level. Those are the hard questions. But that's something that I think a lot of institutions are reckoning with. What exactly does it truly value, right? And that will kind of answer that question about what they should do in that respect.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Keisha.
Unmute. Thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it. So I'm wondering about cases where someone does decide to have a conversation with someone that doesn't respect them or that dehumanizes them. You know, particularly members of marginalized groups. So, you know, the example that gets thrown out a lot here is Daryl Davis, you know, who goes around and has conversations with KKK members. And so, I mean, you described these conversations as conversations that shouldn't be had. And one way of—
No, it's one of the conversations that I would not engage in.
Right.
It really depends on the tolerance of that particular individual, but all things considered, it shouldn't be had, but if one is willing to, then that's on you.
Right. So I guess the question is, like, some people talk about that, like what the person is doing in cases like that is kind of like they're going beyond the call of duty, you know, it's supererogatory, right. Like they're this kind of like, it's kind of heroic of them to go put themselves in this position where they're being disrespected. And then other times I hear people talk about, well, it kind of seems like a failure of self-respect or something like that to be willing to have those conversations. So, and those seem to pull in opposite directions. So I was wondering if you have thoughts on those kinds of cases.
So I'm always careful with saying that what someone is doing is compromising their self-respect. I think that's up to the individual to make that decision for themselves, right? I mean, you know, we go back, you know, W. Du Bois would say, hey, we should protest, and we protest because we have respect for oneself. But if you ask Booker T. Washington, he would say that protesting is begging. And when you beg, you compromise your self-respect. You know. So if you go to a Black Lives Matter protest, and because Booker T. Washington told you that you're not self-respecting, therefore you're not, I don't think that's the argument there, right? I think that's really up to the individual to decide that what they are engaging in is indeed compromising their self-respect. So that's how I feel on that particular end. On the other end, as far as self-sacrificing, listen, there have been martyrs, whether that's physically or literally or metaphorically. And a lot of them that was self-sacrificing, people have benefited from that self-sacrifice. And you're right to point to its supererogatory nature, that it is beyond a call of duty. Here's my, no pun intended for PlayStation. So here's my my worry. My worry is when it comes to education, it's interesting that only certain kinds of individuals are called toward or expected to engage in that kind of education that's that's self-sacrificing, right? Which are women and people of color, right? So that's interesting. We have an asymmetry there, and the question is, we have to ask, why does that asymmetry exist, right? And another thing that I think is problematic, and this goes back to the earlier point when I talked about kind of we expect certain kinds of people to do all the work, whether that's epistemically or whether it's educationally. And that's kind of what I see there, what I would like to see. And this is not to discount what those individuals are doing. But here's my challenge. We see that this is what this person is doing, what these people are doing. We recognize that it's supererogatory. We recognize that, hey, if they're continuing doing, we have to respect their agency, that they're not compromising their self-respect. Then the question is, so what do we do in response to what they're doing, right? One of the things I would suggest is that we recognize that the work that they're doing and people that look like them are doing, that they shouldn't be doing all that work, right? So we should be, as much as that person going around the country, maybe if we are in a socially positioned as such, we need to talk to our fellow socially positioned as such and do the education, sharing that epistemic labor. Because there's a location or a city that person is not going to come to. So we can join them in laboring, right? As opposed to leaving it all up to them. Another thing that we can do is, this is kind of a first point, something that I should have said before, is changing our way in which we're even viewing that person. So I think immediately, changing our way in which they're not engaging in a disrespecting activity, so it changes way. But I think what that calls for is that for us to kind of do things differently as ourselves. Why is it the case that it's always Black people getting in a truck, going to rural parts of America to initiate conversations with people that do not respect them, right? So much so that even if we realize there is someone who's doing that, maybe we should join in that work, right? And I'll leave it. I'll leave it as that.
Thanks.
So admirable, supererogatory. I'm not going to diss them or ascribe any kind of attitude towards them as far as attitudes of self-respect. What I would say is this should not be, they should not be the only ones. Let me figure out how I can join in to make sure that this doesn't become the template for the ways in which we educate ourselves out of disrespect and inhumanity.
Right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We've got about 2 minutes, so there's time for one quick question. And we've heard from a lot of the philosophers, so I wonder if someone else who hasn't had the chance would like to pop a question here or have a comment.
Don't be shy.
No? Yeah, Lucy, go ahead.
Hi, I'm a student, and I had my philosophy professor show me this talk, and I really appreciated it, so thank you. At the beginning,
coming, Lucy.
I remember you talking about being a grad student and talking to your professors. How did you get over that fear and that worry of not feeling like you were taken seriously?
Yeah, how did I? Did it ever go away? I'm not sure. I think I don't know if I got over it, but I think the way in which I met it, let's just say I met it. I don't want to say I got over it, but let's just say the way that I met that worry is that I became serious. Right. So I made sure, so for those, those who don't know, I don't just call up the professors and we just talk whatever comes to mind. There's preparation that occurs. So what I did was prepare. I prepared in ways in which they would have to take me seriously, right? So before we even had the initial conversation, our exchanges were professional in a certain kind of way. I showed a kind of respect towards them. Into the work. I did serious research in preparing them for the conversation. And that's the best that I could have done. And whatever biases they had in connection to a graduate student was then left on them. But I made sure that I met them at their level as best as I could without going outside of who I actually was. But I think the fact that I met them in a very serious way and I respected them and I took them serious was enough to not allow that worry to kind of override my concern. I think it's interesting because I think that particularly as students, not only just as students in relationship to professors, but I also find that certain kinds of individuals also feel a kind of worry about individuals that have probably achieved much more academically than them. And that's always a worry about, would they respect me on their level, right? Would they take me serious in that particular level? A lot of stuff we can't control because I think people are just arrogant and some people just, are jerks. But I think if you take yourself serious, that's the best that you can do, right? And taking yourself seriously is taking this occasion to interact and to have a conversation serious. It's preparing yourself. It's being your authentic self. And I think that's the best that you can bring. And what that person decides to do with that is all on them. It's all on them to exhibit kind of positive character traits back to you. But I think that's the best that you can do. You can never guarantee that someone is going to take you serious. The best you can do is to be serious yourself, and to be your authentic self and allow that person to meet you the other way.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So our time is up, and I think it was, we've had a wonderful conversation here. So I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Myisha, Dr. Myisha Cherry, and for a wonderful talk and the time we spent with her.
Thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it.